Hello and welcome to the Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today we're looking at the big one, the crossover to end all crossovers. That's right, it's the 1996 event story, Onslaught, from Marvel Comics. It all starts with the X-Men. I know the Fantastic Four are Marvel's first family, as they will repeatedly remind us in today's story. But to me, everything really got going with Marvel with the X-Men. It seems like between the X-Men and the Avengers, who both started the same month of the same year, we began seeing everything that would really start to move the Marvel Universe forward. The success of the Mutant Massacre was perhaps the most important moment, as the crossover spurred Marvel to push for nearly yearly crossover events from the X-Men, most of which I've managed to cover by now. The major turning point in these came with Fatal Attractions, which brought Magneto back as a dangerous villain, only for him to be immediately removed from the playing field when Charles Xavier went further than he ever had before, using his telepathy to dive into Magneto's mind and erase it, leaving the villain as a catatonic shell. The consequences to this event would be put on hold when a time-traveling Legion would accidentally kill his own father, Charles Xavier, back in the past before he ever had the chance to form the X-Men, creating a new reality that would come to be called the Age of Apocalypse. This dark timeline would collapse before long, and almost the moment it did, we would begin getting hints at the next major villain for the X-Men, as we learned that something actually could stop the mighty Juggernaut. Something called Onslaught. But Onslaught wouldn't be revealed right away, and the mystery around just who or what Onslaught was would only continue to grow for the better part of a year. In the meantime, the X-Men's lives would only become more complicated as some remnants of the Age of Apocalypse made their way into the main Marvel Universe. The first was the being called Holocaust, who was the son of Apocalypse and an extremely powerful and murderous being in his own right. He earned his name with the wanton destruction he sowed. And fittingly, his first act upon arriving in the 616 universe was to destroy Avalon, the space-based asteroid home of Magneto's acolytes. This caused them to lose track of Magneto's comatose body, but he would seem to appear again before long, somehow younger and with no memories of his past. He would be given the name Joseph by the nun that took him in before he would leave her to seek out the X-Men. Another refugee of the Age of Apocalypse was Hank McCoy. In time, this twisted version of the character would come to be called Dark Beast, and just before the start of this story, he'd actually kidnap the regular Beast, brick him up in a wall like this is the cask of Amontillado, and take his place on the X-Men. The third, and perhaps most important refugee of the collapsed AOA timeline, was Nate Gray. Dubbed X-Man, Nate was basically the AOA's version of Cable, but younger and unencumbered by the techno-organic virus that gave Cable his sweet cyborg arm, and that he was forced to constantly spend part of his telepathic powers in order to control. So in his prime, and free from exterior forces holding him back, Nate is basically the ultimate 20th century genetic mutant that Mr. Sinister had hoped to create, as we learned was his goal from the Inferno event earlier. All these threads come together as the being named Onslaught is finally revealed to us in an event that will be a major turning point for the entire Marvel Universe. So let's see just how that goes, and take this away. The comic opens on Cable and Domino doing a little research of their own, if you know what I mean. I mean that they're attacking a military facility called Camp Hayden to learn about Onslaught. Why? What did you think I meant? Technically, this collection should have started a little earlier with an issue of X-Force that led to this, where X-Force discovered the word Onslaught written in the same facility in what appeared to be blood. Cable and Domino have now returned to Camp Hayden to try to learn more about what that word might mean. But despite meeting heavy gunfire resistance, this turns out to be a dead end. So we move on from Old Man Cable to Young Man Cable. X-Man, Nate Gray, is vacationing in Greece with a girl named Threnody, who actually works for Mr. Sinister to keep an eye on this stranger, since Sinister rightly suspects that Nate Gray is the Ubermensch Sinister has been spending his lifetime trying to create. But Onslaught has its own plans for Nate, and we get our first view of Onslaught, though only in silhouette, as he hires Holocaust to attack and capture Nate. So Holocaust shows up in Greece so he and Nate can have a knockdown, drag-out fight for 2 entire issues before Nate gets angry enough to shatter Holocaust's head dome, and the big bad flees like a little kid. Unfortunately for Nate, though, his powers are so strong that they actually risk killing him, especially when he unleashes them like he just did. Thrinity knows this and urges him to get help, but Nate refuses to meet with the X-Men, not trusting Charles Xavier after they fought in an earlier issue, and confusion over who leads the X-Men convinced Nate that Xavier couldn't be trusted. Thrinity mentions the Avengers as an alternative, and that gets Nate's attention. So he heads off to New York, appearing very briefly in issue 400 of the Avengers. The Avengers, like basically all 90s superheroes, were seeing some massive changes to their characters intended to really shake things up. Iron Man had gone evil and been killed and replaced by a younger version of himself. Wasp had nearly died fighting evil Iron Man, so Hank Pym had exposed her to the same treatment that had originally given her her powers a second time in an effort to save her life, transforming her into a being more like her namesake. And then there's Thor, who had lost Asgard, and also his shirt, apparently, which is obviously the most significant change of all. Before we get to them and what they decide to do, though, we'll need to check in with the X-Men, because Onslaught has finally decided to reveal himself, but only to Jean Grey. He appears to Jean while she's out clothes shopping, because women do be shopping, am I right? As only an astral projection, dressed in armor suspiciously similar to Magneto's. But I'm sure that's not important, please ignore that. He takes her mental projection around town to prove to her that people are inherently hypocrites. Like the townsfolk smiling at her while thinking nasty thoughts about her, which she already knew, or the campaign manager for presidential candidate Graydon Creed that doesn't care one iota about Creed's anti-mutant message. He just wants to be the one to succeed at getting someone into the White House for his own career. Still, not really surprising. The real shocker comes when Onslaught decides to take Jean to Professor Xavier, and it's revealed that back in the early days of the X-Men, just like basically every other member of the team, Xavier had fallen in love with Jean, which is a bit gross. He's like a dad to her. To deal with this, Xavier used his telepathy to essentially erase his own mind of these emotions, pushing them down and keeping them in some dark corner of his brain, something Onslaught insists Charlie does pretty regularly. But I'm sure that's also not important, feel free to ignore that as well. Onslaught goes on to insist he's some kind of new god, and even with her phoenix powers, Jean is unable to harm him in their telepathic battle. He then leaves her with these revelations, and Jean is so shook by the experience that she just acts like nothing even happened with her fellow X-Men. There's then a sort of intermission here as we check back in on Cable as he faces off against Post. Post appeared a bit earlier in some X-Men comics, showing up to test the X-Men and serve as a herald of Onslaught. In order to tie these stories together even more, it is revealed in this Cable issue that Post is a man named Tremaine, that Cable once rescued in his younger mercenary days from the Mandarin, who had himself been experimenting on Tremaine for unknown reasons with unknown experiments. To save Tremaine's life, Cable also infused the man with some of his own blood, despite the techno-organic virus flowing through his veins. Like, why would you intentionally infect someone with such a deadly virus? What the hell, Cable? It's messed up. Anyway, I guess all of those factors serve to make Post this weird bubble bath mascot man that he is today. None of this is really important, especially since Post will barely appear in this story, but I knew some people would be mad if I didn't at least mention him. It's me. I'd be mad. Things really get moving though when Juggernaut attacks the X-Mansion. Or at least Bishop and Gambit, who are finally having a moment too. Bishop is from the future, like Cable, but he's from a future where he learned that someone betrayed the X-Men, and the last person known to have seen them before they died is a man named LeBeau. So Bishop has been convinced that Remy is the traitor, though Gambit's charm has slowly been winning the time cop over, as it has for all of us. Come on, it's Gambit. Juggernaut knocks them both out and delivers them to Jean, who he then asks for help in remembering who Onslaught is. Jugs has an instinctual distrust of his stepbrother, despite Professor X being perhaps more suited to the task that he's asking for. Jean agrees anyway, taking Juggernaut to a secret, psychically shielded room that she says Onslaught revealed to her during their earlier meeting. The rest of the X-Men, meanwhile, unaware of what's happening, run a search for their missing foe, alerting Xavier to Juggernaut's presence at the mansion. It doesn't take Jean long to figure out from Juggy's memories who Onslaught is, and realizing that it's someone inside the X-Mansion, she tells Juggernaut to run for his life. Marco attempts to do as she demands, but finds himself running through twisted nightmare corridors before arriving at his stepbrother. But Chuck is missing, replaced by Onslaught, who is so powerful that he's able to simply remove the powers Juggernaut gets from the Crimson Gem of Sidarok and seemingly trap Jugs inside of the gem. And then, at long last, it's revealed that Onslaught and Charles Xavier are one and the same? Or are they? I mean, yes and no. The comic kind of skims over most of the explanation, giving it to us mostly in bits and pieces, but it breaks down like this. All those dark thoughts Onslaught mentioned Xavier having would build up over time, essentially taking on a life of their own. When Xavier then wiped Magneto's mind during Fatal Attractions, a piece of Magneto's personality, that desire to rule the world with an iron fist, represented in a flashback in an issue of Wolverine by what they call a dark homunculus, entered into Xavier's mind and attached itself to that growing darkness inside of him. Those two bits of personality then did an off-screen fusion dance to create Onslaught. Xavier then calls together his X-Men so he can reveal himself as Onslaught, attempting to convince them to follow him like they did Xavier, but they're not buying what he's selling. Onslaught leaves them to think it over, but instead they start looking for ways to defeat this new nemesis. In a rage, Onslaught attacks them, blowing up Cerebro and knocking out the X-Men. Beast alone offers his services to Onslaught since, again, he's actually an alternate evil version of the character, and we learn that Onslaught isn't as powerful as he supposes, since Xavier is fighting back inside of him. Our first bit of evidence that Onslaught and Xavier aren't actually entirely the same person. Jean manages to slip away, running back to the shielded room she went to with Juggernaut earlier in the hopes of sending out a message to their mutant allies in X-Force, X-Factor, and Excalibur, which finally gives us answers to a question that has been in the X-Men comics for over 100 issues by this point. We're talking years. Because the message Jean sends is the one Bishop saw in the future, though his was corrupted, leaving him with an incomplete understanding of what was happening. Which is why he thought Gambit was the traitor and Xavier was the first to die, when instead it turns out that the message says Xavier is the traitor and Juggernaut was the first to die. Onslaught tracks Jean down and attacks her, fulfilling the ending of that original message, but she's saved by the rest of the X-Men also tracking her down somehow and showing up just in the nick of time. They attack Onslaught until they've seemingly managed to destroy him, but it turns out to be a trick, and he appears behind them to blast them with the full force of his power. Bishop, whose mutant ability is energy absorption, manages to jump in between Onslaught and the X-Men to take the blast. The energy is still enough to knock out the X-Men and Bishop, but his efforts are still enough to prevent the death of the X-Men that was supposed to happen here, the one he knew from his timeline. Impressed and drained, Onslaught leaves the unconscious X-Men to go focus on fulfilling his plan. After he leaves, the Avengers arrive, persuaded by Nate Gray to look into what's happening, and the Avengers discover a destroyed mansion and a paranoid group of X-Men. After the X-Men inform the Avengers about what's happening, they split into 3 teams. One team goes to look for Magneto, to find out how he's involved in this. What they find is Joseph and Rogue. Rogue had more or less taken a sabbatical from the X-Men after finally caving to Gambit's charms and kissing him back right around the time that everything switched over to the Age of Apocalypse. This had left Gambit in a coma and Rogue with just enough of his memories kicking around in her head to send her off on a cross-country road trip attempting to dig around in his past. Eventually, she ran into Joseph/Magneto, and realizing he was a different person without his memories, decided to travel with him and help ensure he turns his talents towards good. That plan is almost ruined when the Avengers show up and assume the worst about him, particularly Quicksilver, and they attack Joseph. After they calm down and the cards are all laid on the table, Joseph decides to help in the fight against Onslaught. The second team goes to the Fantastic Four, because the X-Men had discovered that Xavier had been researching information on Franklin Richards, the son of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman, and whose mutant power is to rearrange matter. What the heroes don't know is that Xavier has been psychically appearing to Franklin for some time now as his imaginary friend Charlie, to prepare the child for what's to come. And I do have to pause for a second to say I love the little joke here from The Thing about Heroes Reborn, with this line about how he and 20 or 30 of his closest friends are about to go on a long trip. I'll explain more on that later, but I promise it's a good joke. But I also want to add that it very much bothers me that Franklin keeps offering Charlie some quote-unquote milk, but that's some very orange milk. No wonder Charlie keeps refusing it. I wouldn't want to drink orange milk either, Chuck. Of course, once the actual Xavier shows up to the Baxter building, and the heroes present quickly realize what's going on, even their combined might isn't enough to stop Onslaught from simply taking Franklin and disappearing with him, while also blowing up the top floors of their building. Does anyone else think that from above, the Fantastic Fours on top of the building look a little too much like a much more problematic symbol? The X-Men, meanwhile, head to England for our only little tie-in with Excalibur, who always get left out of the X crossovers, and this is no real exception. Yeah? Exception? I'm funny. All the X-Men do at Mirror Island is discover a secret room hidden in the basement where Xavier had apparently been Batmaning it up, secretly developing ways to counter every mutant in existence, particularly the members of the X-Men in the case that any of them ever went rogue. Well, not rogue, just like, bad. That's like an inverse rogue, I guess. This did include himself, and he had developed plans for an armor that could shield its wearer from Xavier's psionic attacks. The X-Men just have to get back home and build it. Which is easier said than done, as we learn when checking in with X-Factor as they finally join the crossover. They get in on the action thanks to their current leader, Forge, who had been working on restoring a Sentinel, one of those giant robots designed to hunt down and eliminate mutants. The Sentinel suddenly wakes up, attacks the team, and then flees. They follow it to a factory full of other Sentinels that's currently being guarded by Post and Dark Beast. Post manages to delay X-Factor by revealing that he has Havoc, and not only that, has managed to brainwash and take control of him. It's also revealed that recent Team Edition Random is a traitor working for Post, though it's one of those situations where he's come to like the team and feels bad about betraying them. And I'm sure that repentance will totally help him stick around and be an important character for many years to come. With X-Factor pausing to focus on Polaris's love triangle drama that this reveals, Onslaught is able to power up and launch all the Sentinels in the factory, sending out hundreds of the robots to completely lock down New York, as the former mutant hunters instead begin searching for any powered individuals to attack. This is where we get most of the less direct tie-in stories, as various heroes like Spider-Man, the heroic Green Goblin, and even S.H.I.E.L.D. are shown fighting the Sentinels, with additional name drops like Daredevil and the New Warriors. But while X-Factor may have failed at stopping the Sentinel launch, they do break their way deep enough into the facility to discover Beast and Dark Beast. Dark Beast attempts to recruit Sabretooth and Mystique, who are being forced to work for X-Factor with the aid of painful restraining devices. But they're not buying what the not-real McCoy is selling. So Fake Beast fake tortures himself to pretend that he's the real Beast for them to rescue. only he slips when he mentions being aware of Onslaught in battle with the X-Men, and he's also not fooling Sabretooth's nose. Sabretooth tracks down and frees the real Beast, who then quickly subdues his alternate universe counterpart, ending X-Factor's involvement in the plot. Onslaught's plan didn't stop at filling the city with Sentinels, though. Using Franklin's ability to generate matter, Onslaught raises a giant citadel for himself in Central Park, then sets off a massive EMP detonation that knocks out electricity throughout the city, including the electric-powered Avengers like Iron Man and Vision. It also knocks the Blackbird out of the sky as the X-Men are attempting to return with their plans for the anti-Xavier armor. Although the story will literally just ignore this ever happened at all, and we'll see Cyclops arriving just fine with no mention of the crash ever again. Great work, team! The X-Men join with the Avengers on an assault on Onslaught, where they manage to blast a hole in Onslaught's armor that Thor flies through in order to pull out Xavier's physical form and free the Professor from Onslaught's grasp. Without the host body, everyone expects Onslaught to just die. But by this point, he has become so powerful on his own that he no longer needs Xavier. And without Xavier's resistance, this has actually only made Onslaught more powerful, as he proves when he unleashes a psionic storm that the gathered heroes narrowly avoid being killed by. Apocalypse shows up here, having been watching the events with the Watcher, and having decided that Onslaught won't leave him enough of a world to conquer himself, he desires to go with Cable onto the astral plane in an attempt to remove Franklin from Onslaught as well, which should actually be enough to reduce Onslaught's power. Only, Apocalypse's plan to free Franklin is by killing the 8-year-old, so fortunately Sue Storm followed along invisibly and stops Apocalypse. This destroys their element of surprise though, and they're forced out of the astral plane and left with seeking an alternative. That alternative will be the psionic armor, which Iron Man is forced to flee across the city from Sentinels in order to reach his lab and get the armor created. In a rush, he's only really able to get some helmets made, but the heroes are hoping it will be enough. Before we get there though, there's one last piece of the puzzle, and that is Nate Gray. Back when we saw the Avengers arriving at the X-Mansion, X-Force also showed up not long after. Knowing that Charles Xavier was keeping tabs on Nate Gray like he was Franklin Richards, Cyclops asked X-Force to stay behind at the mansion and keep an eye on Nate. A job they almost immediately fail at when Mr. Sinister shows up and attacks, wanting to claim Nate for himself as the weapon he'd always intended Cable to be. And no one on X-Force can fight Mr. Sinister with his mysterious undefined powers. No one except for Caliban, whose physiology was modified by Apocalypse during Fall of the Mutants, and something about that modification made him specially suited for facing off against Sinister. In desperation, Domino sets off the mansion's self-destruct, blowing up the mansion just like the last time Sinister was here during Inferno. Still, none of this is enough to stop Sinister, so Nate finally takes it upon himself to attack. He had already killed the Sinister of the Age of Apocalypse universe, so he's convinced he can do the same here. But Sinister was ready for the attack, turning Nate's psychic energy back at him and X-Force, knocking them all out and allowing Sinister to abduct the X-Man. X-Force is trapped under the rubble and on the verge of death, and each finds themselves living through dreams of a better life, while a mysterious figure attempts to help them escape their predicament. The figure turns out to be Onslaught, and his goal turns out to be actually getting them to all except passing on, but the team realizes it in time to fight back. None of which is actually important, but I wanted to mention it because it might be the best single issue of the entire crossover, so it deserves some respect. Sinister attempts to convince Nate Gray to just accept his role as a weapon, but Nate continues to resist his supposed destiny. Franklin Richards, seemingly inspired by the attempt from Cable and his mom to rescue him, manages to reach out psychically to Nate. Sinister demands Nate ignore the call, but X-Man of course sees no reason to start listening to Sinister now, and instead embraces the chance to help the poor kid. Only, it was of course a trap. It was Onslaught reaching out to Nate because, just as Cyclops had suspected, Onslaught wanted to add Nate's powers to his own, just as he had Franklin's. And now, with Nate's incredibly powerful psionic abilities combined with Franklin's ability to rearrange matter, Onslaught is ready to realize his ultimate goal. And we all know what that is. Right? Right? Okay, so I haven't really mentioned it yet because honestly, the comic basically doesn't talk about it, like, at all. In fact, mostly Marvel seemed to suspect that you'd pick up his motivation from the press releases and extra content included in each comic. So far, Onslaught has sort of alluded to a vague goal of creating a world perfected for mutants, presumably by killing all non-mutants. With X-Man's mind open to him, Onslaught learns of the Age of Apocalypse, a world where mutants were in control, but also sees just what a disaster that world turned out to be. After speaking with a recovered Xavier, Onslaught decides that killing all the regular humans isn't enough. Now, everyone must die. So the FF, the Avengers, the X-Men, and even Doctor Doom get together to launch one final assault on Onslaught, using the psionic shielding that Xavier invented to actually be able to fight him. But their physical might still proves no match for Onslaught, at least until Jean hits on the idea of separating Bruce Banner's mind from the Hulk's. This turns Hulk back into the mindless, raging beast that he hasn't been in a long time, because this version of the Hulk is basically unstoppable. The angrier he gets, the stronger he gets, and up against a seemingly unstoppable force like Onslaught, the Hulk only gets angrier and angrier until he's strong enough to destroy Onslaught's physical form. Just as before though, this still isn't enough to stop this ultimate villain. Untethered from his physical body, Onslaught simply becomes a being of pure energy. With no means of stopping such a thing, Thor does the heroic move of deciding to become Onslaught's new vessel, so that the heroes can have something to attack. But even an Asgardian isn't enough to contain Onslaught, so while Xavier frees Nate and Franklin from Onslaught's influence, the other heroes all join Thor in entering the floating energy, adding their own mass to the equation. Reed warns the gathered mutants that they cannot enter the energy because they'll only give Onslaught more strength, whereas anyone else, even Inhumans, weaken Onslaught with their presence. When all the gathered heroes, and Doctor Doom, who was volunteered for self-sacrifice by Iron Man, have entered into the energy, the mutants left behind fire everything they have into the floating broth, until it explodes, seemingly killing the heroes inside, but also finally bringing an end to Onslaught. Except for all the times writers will want to bring him back for some event or special story or something, but we don't need to talk about that right now. The crisis is over, but we're already moving on to future stories. The heroes, it will turn out, aren't dead at all. But just like Things Horoscope said, they've simply traveled to another dimension, so that their comic could be outsourced to other companies, primarily Image Comics, for the short-lived Heroes Reborn event. But the people of the Marvel Universe, unaware of this intercompany crossover, will blame mutants for the death of the world's greatest heroes, as Graydon Creed increases his fear-mongering against mutants to boost his presidential campaign. Obviously, unlike any modern president, surely, Xavier, now powerless, surrenders himself to Val Cooper to help convince people that the Onslaught threat could never happen again. Though this gets him thrown into a secret mutant internment camp run by Bastion, a villain who has only started cropping up recently, but will be an important figure in the next X-Men crossover event, Operation Zero Tolerance, which I will probably talk about next time I cover some X-Men comics. But for now, we need to jump universes and into the breakdown. This comic was clearly being built up for years, and it's unfortunate that it came out following the comic bubble burst of the 90s. After Death of Superman, both Marvel and DC became obsessed with breaking down and reimagining basically all of their characters in major crossover events. And readers were undoubtedly getting exhausted of that by the time this event came along, with basically the sole intent of doing exactly that for characters like Iron Man, Captain America, and the Fantastic Four. And it doesn't help that this is such a massive crossover. Aside from featuring tie-ins from every running X-Men title, which is already a lot, in creating a couple new issues of a new comic, it also has tie-in issues in Avengers, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Incredible Hulk, Spider-Man, Green Goblin, Punisher, and Thor. I also read the X-Men Road to Onslaught collections in preparation for this, and the immediate drop in quality once the event actually starts from both the writing and art is pretty astonishing. We're left with a big boiling mess like the hero-filled ball of energy at the end of the story. And it's a shame, honestly, because there are good elements here. Like I said, they were clearly building towards this story for a long time, and it's fascinating to watch it all finally come together. And pretty cool to see Xavier go evil. Look how creepy! Onslaught could have been such a cool and unique villain too, if they hadn't tried to keep literally everything about him a mystery up until the very end. Also, as someone who is not a Nate Gray fan, his prevalence in the story, coupled with the fact that his comic tended to have both the worst writing and art of those collected here, made so much of this a real slog to have to get through. It's kind of a shame that most of the best stories here ended up being the not directly connected tie-ins or the more one-off stories. Like the Hulk issues, that I didn't really go into, the Spider-Man issues, and that one X-Force issue. Really not a good sign when the main plot issues feel like they're just unremarkable points in a sea of confusion. So for that, I'm giving this series a recommendation level of low. The biggest reason to read this story is for its impact on the Marvel Universe, and the second biggest reason is to see how much potential Onslaught had as a villain. I wish I could say there are many reasons to check this story out aside from that, but that's just really not the case. The collected editions get 3 Onslaught helmets, which we're saying is a good thing, because if nothing else, Onslaught at least looked really cool, right? Right, guys? All 3 volumes are absolutely packed with content, not just including every main issue and every tie-in, but the first several X-Men issues following it that serve as an epilogue, and also a ton of bonus content that includes extra art, variant, and panorama covers, and the press releases I mentioned surrounding Onslaught in the event. All in all, you're getting some pretty good collections if you're really feeling the need to own this story. Thanks everybody for watching, and sorry for such a long break between videos. I try not to let this happen, but I got sick with COVID for a week, and then I was traveling for a week, and I've just been insanely busy at work, so I just haven't had the time to work on videos. I'm trying to get caught up and get some more videos out. I'm gonna try to cover the Heroes Reborn event next, but let me know if you think I should cover the 4 main Heroes Reborn series as well. I think it would be fun. And feel free to leave any other comment, and also to like and subscribe and all the things so you can help the channel out. And so you can help yourself out to be sure to be here next time, and I hope to see you then, right here in the Comic Cave.